Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is our second episode. We're recording on Monday, October 26th at 2:31 p.m. Eastern Time. And initially, we intended to start this show by going through the definitions of God, the commonly accepted understandings of who and what God is, and then just demonstrate how if we start with one, we can derive most of the others with most of the attributes. But then Josh and I were talking about one of the attributes of God, and I think this is a very important attribute. It's the attribute of omnibenevolence. You know, the God is all good, and that's a very problematic attribute for many people, especially for atheists, because atheists say, well, how can God be all good and all powerful and there be pain and suffering and evil in the world? So we're going to start with that. We're going to start with this most difficult, I think, of challenges in understanding and accepting God's nature. So Joshua, start us off with this. How do you see God in terms of his attribute of omnibenevolence?
Yeah, well, what occurred to us as we were just having this conversation, getting ready, warming up for the show, is that, you know, everybody kind of has a sense of, well, if God's all powerful, then why is there evil and suffering? That means he can't obviously be all loving and only love, right? And it occurred to us maybe how we think of omni is wrong. And essentially, our new way of thinking of it that we're exploring today is to say omnibenevolence means that anywhere there is love, that is God. God is there anytime love is happening. That doesn't mean anytime that there's evil happening in the world that God is not also there, because that would be all powerful, right? An evil ruler, right, causing intentionally because they want to make evil, bad things happen to people. That's a form of power, right? So that would be omnipotence. And not saying that's how God is and we should think of God as an evil ruler, but maybe what the scriptures and these wisdom traditions are trying to teach us is to think in terms of anytime anything is happening, anytime there is action and causality in the world, to understand we can deepen our relationship to reality, to causality, and to God by understanding it in terms of power that is playing out. And we can relate to this power and learn to enhance our spiritual lives, enhance our potential, enhance our relationships in suffering by knowing God is playing out there and having this concept of God, just like we would have a relationship with anybody else, just like we would have a relationship with somebody we love, even somebody we don't love. We would get to know them, learn them, and understand what triggers them, understand how they trigger us. And this is ultimately what causality, this is ultimately what science has done, is tried to make that as consistent as possible. And so maybe the infinite wisdom of God, knew that we were these types of beings, that were highly social creatures, right? And that our whole cognition is based around being with each other, learning about each other, because just we're so numb to the fact of we want to go to Mars. What if aliens are here? But look at each other, look at what we are. We're just these amazing creatures, right? But we're around each other so much we take that for granted. It's like the aliens out there want to see an alien, but that alien would be a human, and that would be crazy amazing to see this consciousness, living thing that they'd never seen before. And we could encounter each other like this as if we first saw this miraculous thing that God had created every time we encounter each other, right? Even though we saw each other yesterday, even though we're sick of each other, we're mad at each other, whatever it is, but to know God and see this causality, then we can invoke this all-consuming love that is based on getting to know each other and getting to know God through each other.
All right, so basically we're saying that, yes, that rather than defining God as being all good in the sense of being completely good, we're saying that God being all good means that whenever there is goodness happening in this world, uh, that is God. And that, to my mind, that brings an analogy that I think we can make sense of, that applies to our lives. For example, we we generally have loving parents, and our parents are not all good. Some our parents make mistakes. They sometimes hurt us unintentionally, but we still define our parents as good. And we still, like when they're, I mean, it's not a completely perfect analogy because our parents aren't all powerful, but we just as we want to see our parents as good, we want to see God as good. We want to, like, that's the part of God that we want to connect with. Um, and yes, and in terms of the suffering in the world, how do you address that? I mean, the way I address it is that, um, I mean, I just basically, maybe I punt on this. Maybe I say to myself, well, I'm just not intelligent enough, nor do I have enough knowledge to be able to judge, whether God is doing something that is either good or evil, that's not so good. Uh, and I do have a problem with that. For example, like, if I was God, imagine if you were God, right? And I had, I was completely powerful. I create this world. My reason tells me that I would create a world completely without pain and suffering at all. I would make, beings like us, human beings and other sentient beings, who feel pleasure, and actually who only feel pleasure, who wouldn't feel pain. But how would you address, that aspect of like, when things that are not good happen? How do you address that within the context of seeing? And I get, yes, I think it's wise to see God as good, and we try to. I certainly do in my life. But how do you again accommodate and incorporate the evil that happens within this all good God?
Well, I guess, first I would say God could be all good in the sense he's trying to teach us wisdom, but, he's not necessarily all powerful in the sense he could make a rock so heavy he could lift, or he could create a universe that defies the laws that he initially created to be consistent, right, throughout time. So he's trying to teach us wisdom and all good in that sense, just like a parent, that's their intention, right? Um, think of it as we come into this world as babies, right? A blank slate. We're not a blank slate in the sense that we don't have genetic predispositions, and the human species doesn't have these drives for survival or whatever, reasons that it has to deal with that can completely, determine our behavior. But we're a blank slate, and we're open to new stories. We're open to, we're just so eager. You can just see it in every child you look at. They're so eager to learn things, to hear stories, to understand the world, so that their mind, their consciousness, interacting with the stimuli in their environment, can make sense of it and then try to act on it, right? And then out of that create an identity, right? So we're a blank slate open to religion, right? And it's been a bit of a problem that religions have tried to, enforce one way for everybody, right? And we need to have a little bit of forgiveness for religions. So maybe some religions have felt their the best thing they could do is try to make these children conform by scaring them with eternal burning in hell, right, for their sins, right? And maybe, it seems dogmatic now, it seems evil, it seems like child abuse now, where we have abundance and in our current reality. But maybe there's a time that wasn't. Maybe starving in the desert, the whole tribe could be wiped out if there was a famine. That may have been the only thing. Of course, God didn't want the species or the faith to be wiped out, so that might have been relevant. And all of these different forms of dealing with these issues is essentially, um, what's allowed us to have access to so many tools right now in our current form state of our evolution of consciousness. Um, so, my understanding, my current way of viewing things is to not discount any of these, right? Not force them on anyone, but provide access to as many tools as we possibly can and allow each person to know what tool works best for them in their situation, essentially. And this is how we have a personal relationship with God, a personal relationship with ourselves in all possibilities. And when you have that, then you can start to solve these problems of, sin and evil, whether it's you committing it or somebody else committing it, because you start to learn how the universe works and what it means to be human, and how different things affect you, whether it's what you ate in the morning, or whether you had some coffee, or whether somebody else yelled at you yesterday, so now you find yourself lashing out at somebody else, whether it's meditation, whatever it is. And I think that's ultimately this wisdom that we're evolving into more and more. And now through science and technology, we have access to so many tools, so many tools that the past religions, which were systems theory, they were sciences to try to figure out, to try to make sense of this mystery of why we aren't always in control of ourselves, right? I mean, Paul the Apostle said clearly in the Bible several times, this holy, sacred saint of a man that none of us, that we put up on a pedestal and none of us expect to be as good as said over and over again how he wasn't in control of himself. He had no control over his will at many times in his life.
All right. Yeah, you've covered a lot of area there, and a lot of it is a lot of what we're going to present to the audience in terms of reforming our religions so they are more accessible to more people. But I want to go back to before we started this episode. We were kind of like acknowledging that while we're presenting some material that we believe is new to the audience, that we hopefully have thought about in more detail, perhaps know more comprehensively than people in the audience, this is also an exploration for us to help us to better understand God. And so, like, when you were talking about like that, something that we agree that we've talked about in the past, that like God being all powerful does not mean that God can make, for example, 1 + 1 = 3. That's against God's nature. Or like if God is eternal, God can't suddenly cease to exist, because that's not within what all powerful means. So now, relating it to evil, the thought came to me, well, maybe in a way that we can't understand. And I've heard people say this before, but for some reason I've discounted it, but I think I'm getting it now. Maybe in some way we can't understand. And the way I've heard it is that basically in order to feel pleasure and to have goodness, there has to be evil. There has to be evil in this world. So that's why, we're in a world with both good and evil. But fortunately for us, here's where the message of hope. God created us as hedonic beings, meaning we seek pleasure and avoid pain. And history tells us that, for example, these years we're living in, this 21st century, people are living so much better in so many ways, being healthier, living longer, less violence, so many benefits we have in this age than that people in earlier ages, and not everyone naturally, there still are, too many poor people on the planet, but in general, we're living so much better than people did in past generations, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that what gives me hope is that, yes, God, in his omnibenevolence, in his goodness, designed us to create a better and better and better world. And that's the kind of world God wants for us. So I think that's, when we think of God in terms of his being all good, I think that's what God wants for us. God wants us to eventually, I believe, live on this planet in a state of complete bliss, where somehow through technology, through spirituality, through religion, we evolve beyond all suffering. How's that sound?
Yeah, it really resonates with me. One of the things that has caused me a lot of contemplation, let's say, is it seems like the generation before me really struggles with the new generation after me, the millennials more so, and they have this save the world, change the world attitude, and and the and they're leaving religion in droves as well. And the older generation doesn't get that. It's a lot of them that I'm around in my region certainly, and it seems like, well, why wouldn't you want to do good in the world, etc. And this curious thing that they're leaving religions as well. And I think we all have this desire, this drive to have purpose, to make meaning of our lives, and that meaning to not just enhance our own lives, but make the world a better place for everyone. And I think this is a way, this is a view of religion, of these religious technologies, these spiritual technologies. Just like you would go to school, you go to college to learn something, to master it, right? And you develop that career, you'd have a career around it, and you might serve people in that way and make money for yourself, provide for yourself. But while you're doing that, it's evolving the technology, it's evolving the knowledge. So the next generation that goes to school, they're actually learning what you discovered during your career, and the education changes. And I think religion, you know, has a hard time accepting that religion evolves, that religion is a form of culture. But it's very clear, through anthropology, and you look at the history of religion, every generation changes. That doesn't mean God's not consistent, not just as consistent as the laws of physics. And that actually, um, alludes to why religion has to evolve and has to keep changing and growing and getting better, because the laws of physics, the laws of nature might be consistent, but we're understanding them more and more, and understanding how to make a better world through interacting with this causality.
I think that addresses what God demands of us in each generation. I think, several generations back, they went through a world war, two world wars, and there was a lot of, you know, military conflict. And fortunately, through God's will, we have a much more peaceful world now, but it's also a world that's much more at risk, specifically climate change. And then we have like antibiotic resistance. We have some major, this pandemic. I did an entire series how, like, unless we end factory farming, the farming of animals, we can expect, more pandemics. Some may be a lot worse. So the idea is, the millennials, God is demanding of them that they not be satisfied with just make improving relationships between people, that they tackle this idea of other sentient beings, the animals on the planet. They tackle the survival, the climate of the planet. And yes, I think for past generations, they didn't get that because they didn't need to get that. That wasn't a challenge that they were faced with. But yes, God, I think, is challenging us, according to how the world has evolved. So like what we're challenged with is different from what our ancestors 1,000, 2,000 years ago were challenged with. And naturally, this is going to change as we move into the future. All right, so let's pull back again to this idea of God being all good. So what is the benefit of seeing God as all good, as opposed to seeing God in some other ways?
Well, I mean, you could take the atheist perspective, compare it to the atheist perspective of seeing God as an evil thing, and that's, ruined humanity, and right. Um, what are the other ways that you could see it? So there's the all good, infinitely good, and could do and only does good. Then a lot of people have this problem. Well, why is there evil if he could do anything and he's all powerful? I mean, for me, it really comes back to, right, this personal relationship with my life, my existence, my understanding, right? you know, you know, we're much more subjective beings having infinitely complex experiences, emotional experiences, and rational and logic and conversation in our head than we are objective beings, right? And if we don't have harmony and peace with that and with how the world is affecting us and our struggles and our frustrations and our anger and whatever else it is, then we can't have peace with each other, and we can't have peace with our understanding of God, and we can't grow in that relationship. And we certainly, will have be challenged to all get together in the same room on Sundays to develop this if we're not at peace with ourselves and accepting ourselves. So to view this aspect of God as all good, in the sense of anywhere there is good happening, that's God demonstrating God's power, right? And to learn from that. And that is how we grow this relationship with God in this aspect. Anything that there is bad happening, that's also God playing it out to teach us, the nature of reality, so that the next time that exact same situation happens, then our, biopsycho energetic spiritual being can react differently because of our expanded new relationship with God, and it actually turns into a good situation.
All right, you raised, a very important question. If we're not seeing God as all good, what are the other alternatives? And one alternative is that, well, God is neutral. God is neither good nor bad. God is just like everything. This is like the atheist naturalist perspective that, everything is arbitrary, everything is random. And that's not satisfying to me. And like, I want to kind of like equate this with how I choose to see the afterlife. There's certain options we have. And, we die. What happens after we die? Well, one idea is that, like, well, nothing happens. We're dead, and that's it. Game over. We cease to exist. That's kind of boring to me. I mean, that's just, then another option is, well, there's two places. We either go to a heaven if we're good, or a hell, an eternal hell if we're bad. And I can't conceive of even the worst, the most evil God condemning anyone to an eternity of suffering for, like, what we do within the span of 80, 100 years. That prospect doesn't seem to make sense to me. So, then there's another alternative that's logical is, well, we all go to this perfect place of bliss. Not just the good people, even Trump goes there. So, I mean, we all go there. And I choose to believe this because it feels the best. So in other words, I couldn't, give you any evidence or provide evidence for it, but given the options, it seems wisest to really have something to look forward to. Now, if we, relate this to God and acknowledge our lack of complete knowledge and lack of strong intelligence to be able to understand God, then we're just guessing, to a certain extent at God's nature in terms of his goodness. So just as like it's wiser to believe, and at least, I choose to believe that we all go to this blissful state after we die. I think it's wiser, because it makes us feel so much better, because we are hedonic creatures, and seeking pleasure and happiness is what we live for. It makes more sense to see God as all good. And again, as you're saying it, with the qualification that all good means that if good is happening, this is God. And also, I think, to add to it, that God, this is what God wants for us. This is what God created the world for.
Yeah, the afterlife is such a, interesting issue there. And for me, I came to this realization, it dawned on me, that if we look at it from a meta perspective, comparing all religions, right, it always comes back to the same orientation to our existing life now. It's trying to drive our psychology into this relational behavior, this relational sense of reality with God, to control or to conform our behavior for our own benefit, presumably, right? So, whether it's what you do here is going to determine whether you go to hell or spend eternity in paradise. Or, some traditions, especially in the East, say, well, if you don't get it right the first time, you're going to have to be reincarnated and repeat it until you do get it right. Right. And so again, it all comes down to being able to teach the next generation, what the previous generation learned about how to be moral, how to have happiness, all these things, and when I realized that, it allowed me to relax on, making a strong position on the afterlife. I really want to get it right here and allow my understanding of it here while we're here now to allow to better my own life and to better my relationships and help other people to have better lives. And that's kind of the takeaway I take from all of it. Even though I hope it is, more blissful and and omnibenevolent, even if I don't get that right, I screw it up.
And you reminded me, I don't mean to suggest that the belief in this eternal hell wasn't useful when they came up with it, however many thousands of years ago, because like back then they didn't have a criminal justice system. They didn't have an education system. They were just trying to get people to do good. And somebody thought, yes, if we create this like horrible scenario that like, if they're not good, they're going to end up in eternity. That would be a good motivation. It probably was for many people. And I guess my thinking is that fortunately now, we're in a world where we have evolved so much in terms of our morality that many of us, in so many cases, we don't do good because of a fear of punishment if we do evil. We do good because we recognize the benefits of goodness, that it helps us, it helps the world. We care about others, we care about ourselves. All right, we've got about a minute left. So I think this has been an excellent exploration. For tomorrow's show, we may go into the, the good thing about the show is it's going to evolve episode by episode. Again, we're exploring God, relative to what, these episodes relative what we're exploring now. And so, so let's see what we will explore tomorrow, whether we'll continue with the omnibenevolence or whether we'll go to another attribute. Okay, Josh, we've got about 36 seconds.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward at some point to get into how the different religions relate to these issues of controlling behavior, whether that's changing behavior or keeping it consistent over time, right? And that relates to our sense of self. Are we consistent over time, or do we need to change in ways? And let's demonstrate how it's not an issue of religion versus religion. Each religion within itself is divided over this because they haven't talked about it explicitly.
All right, we got like 8 seconds. Right. Josh, thanks. We're going to be back to explore this next time. Thanks. Right. We'll see you tomorrow.